From the frozen steppes of the north came 30,000 Mongol warriors, iron-armored riders who had crushed kingdoms, burned empires, and brought the world to its knees. They believed no wall too high, no nation too small to conquer, but far to the south, beyond rivers and mist, stood a kingdom of barely 100,000 defenders, farmers, fishermen, and warriors, fighting not for glory, but for survival. When the most feared army on earth met a people who would rather burn their cities than surrender, the world awaited another swift Mongol victory. Instead, what unfolded would defy history itself. A storm met another storm, and in that clash of fire and thunder, a legend was born that would echo through the ages. In the final days of 1257, a shadow swept across Asia, the shadow of the Mongol Empire. 30,000 riders, armored in iron and fire, moved south like a storm of steel. They had crushed kingdoms, burned cities, and left the world trembling in their wake. Now their eyes turned toward a small kingdom beyond the Red River. Seviest, the great Khan, demanded tribute. But in the court of Thieng Long, Emperor Trần Thái Tông refused. He had rebuilt his nation from the ashes of civil unrest, restoring unity where division once ruled. Under his leadership, Seviest had risen from chaos into strength. He had fortified his people's spirit as much as their walls, teaching them that freedom was not the gift of kings but the birthright of those who endured. When the Mongol envoys came demanding submission, the emperor's answer was calm but unyielding. He would never bow before a foreign throne. His defiance was not born of arrogance, but of duty to his ancestors and his land. The refusal enraged the empire. To the Mongols, denial was treachery, and treachery could be answered only with war. The invasion was placed under the command of Uriankadai, son of the legendary Subutai, the same brilliant strategist who had once shattered Europe's armies. Uriankadai led a force of 30,000 hardened men, veterans of endless conquest. His army was a masterpiece of Mongol warfare, swift horse archers capable of striking from beyond sight, armored lancers whose charges could break kingdoms, and engineers who could build bridges or tear down city walls within hours. Their strength was precision, discipline, and the raw terror they inspired. No army in Asia had yet stood against them and lived, until now. Opposing them was an army of roughly 100,000 Vietnamese. They were drawn from every corner of the land, farmers who laid down their plows, fishermen who traded nets for spears, and militias raised from villages along the rivers and coasts. They lacked the polished discipline and iron armor of their invaders. Their weapons were simple, their mounts few, their formations loose, yet they possessed something the Mongols did not: the knowledge of their homeland. They understood the rivers that swelled and shifted with the rains, the jungles that could conceal thousands, and the tides that could drown an unwary army. Above all, they fought not for conquest, but for survival, for their homes, their ancestors, and the soil beneath their feet. Emperor Trần Thái Tông understood what few others would have dared to admit, that to meet the Mongols head-on was to invite annihilation. He turned instead to patience and deception, the art of letting arrogance become its own downfall. His plan was elegant in its simplicity: withdraw the army, abandon the capital, and let the enemy march into emptiness. Hunger, exhaustion, and disease would do what swords could not. When the invaders were stretched thin, isolated and weary, the counterstroke would fall. To the Mongols, retreat was weakness. To the Vietnamese, it was strategy, survival, disguised as surrender. As the iron tide rolled southward, the emperor's words echoed through his ranks: "Let them come. The land will fight with us." By the dawn of 1258, the storm from the north had reached the heart of Haziville. Villages burned in their wake, the rice fields were trampled into mud, and the cries of the displaced rose with the smoke into the cold winter sky. To the Mongols it was another effortless campaign, another nameless kingdom soon to vanish from their maps. Uriankadai rode ahead of his army, his armor caked with dust, his expression as hard as the steel he wore. Scouts returned one after another with the same report. No resistance, no army, no defenders. The Vietnamese had vanished into the jungles as if swallowed by the earth. To Uriankadai, this was victory without battle. Yet to Emperor Trần Thái Tông, it was only the first step of his design. Even as the invaders advanced, the emperor's orders were carried out with precision. Thin Klong, the jewel of Hazivir, was evacuated. Granaries were sealed shut, wells poisoned, bridges torn down, and the city's stores of food and grain removed. The capital was stripped bare, every sign of life erased, leaving behind only an eerie silence. When the Mongol vanguard finally reached Thin Klong, they found a ghost city. The streets were deserted, the markets empty, and the air hung still with the scent of smoke and ash. Horses clattered through narrow alleys, their echoes bouncing off the stone walls. The palace gates stood wide open, and within the great hall, the emperor's throne sat abandoned beneath drifting dust. Uriankadai dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the desolation. He had conquered nothing but air, yet pride would not allow hesitation. He declared victory all the same. Fires were kindled in the courtyards, and his men feasted in the royal halls, raising toasts to the great Khan. The banners of the empire fluttered over the silent roofs of the capital as the night grew long. But beneath the revelry, a strange unease took root. The air was heavy, the mist thick upon the river. The walls of the city seemed to whisper with the wind. For the first time in years of conquest, the conquerors could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the land itself was waiting. From the shadows of the river, unseen eyes watched their every move. Far away along the Red River, Emperor Trần Thái Tông stood aboard his flagship, the great vessel gently rocking with the rhythm of the current. Behind him, hundreds of warboats waited in disciplined silence, their hulls dark against the water. The soft, rhythmic beat of distant drums echoed across the river like a heartbeat rising from the soul of the land itself. The humid air carried the faint scent of rain and smoke, mingling with the quiet tension that bound every soldier in stillness. His generals stood beside him, their faces illuminated by the flickering lanterns of the deck. They were men hardened by years of battle, their eyes fixed toward the mist that cloaked the enemy's camp. Every breath, every rustle of armor, seemed to carry the weight of the moment before the storm. "The time of patience is over," the emperor said quietly, his voice low yet steady. "Let them think we are broken. At dawn, the rivers will rise." The rain began as a whisper, a few soft drops tapping against the wooden decks, then spreading across the surface of the river. The mist thickened, rolling like smoke through the sleeping land, swallowing the lights of Tharing Long. The storm that had waited in silence for so long was ready to strike. When dawn broke, it came not with light, but with an eerie pallor that hung over the Red River like the breath of a sleeping beast. Mist curled above the water, thick and white, veiling the shapes that moved beneath it. To the Mongol sentries camped along the riverbank, it seemed like another quiet morning in a conquered land. Fires burned low, soldiers lounged in their tents, unaware of what waited just beyond the fog. Beneath that curtain of mist, however, the army of Umtsi Visht waited, patient, silent, and coiled like a predator ready to spring. At the center of the fleet, Emperor Trần Thái Tông stood tall on his flagship. Around him, hundreds of warboats floated in perfect formation. They were small, sleek vessels built for speed and maneuvering through the maze of rivers that wound through the delta. Each carried soldiers crouched low with spears, swords, and bows ready. Their faces were painted black with soot, their eyes glinting like shadows. No one spoke. Only the faint creak of oars and the steady drum of rain broke the silence. Across the mist, laughter and voices drifted faintly from the Mongol camp. Soldiers feasted on stolen grain and wine, unaware of the danger creeping toward them. Guards leaned lazily on their spears, drowsy from the night's indulgence. Horses stood knee-deep in the river, drinking peacefully as the empire's banners hung limply in the damp air. The army that had once terrified the world now seemed careless and exposed, lulled into complacency by their illusion of victory. Then it came, the sound that shattered the morning calm. A single deep beat of a war drum rolled across the river, then another, then 100, each one heavier than the last, until the water itself seemed to tremble. The river exploded into motion. From the depths of the fog burst the war boats of Visht, cutting through the current with deadly precision. Arrows soared in dense black clouds, their tips hissing through the mist. Flaming projectiles followed, streaking through the air before crashing into the Mongol camp. Fire bloomed across the riverbank in bursts of orange and gold, turning the mist into a wall of smoke and flame. Horses screamed in panic as tents went up in fire. Men stumbled from their sleep, reaching for weapons that were already too hot to touch. Shouts of alarm turned to chaos as arrows fell like rain, striking from every direction. "Strike now!" The emperor's voice rang out over the drums. The fleet surged forward. Warboats slammed into the shallows, their warriors leaping into the water, wading through mud and fire. From both riverbanks, more soldiers emerged, men who had hidden through the night in the mangroves and reeds, waiting for this moment. The Mongols, trapped between the blazing river and the flooded plain, scrambled to form lines, but the ground betrayed them. The soft, sucking mud dragged at their boots and horses alike. Cavalrymen tried to charge, but their mounts sank deep, flailing helplessly as arrows and spears rained down upon them. The clash was deafening. Spears shattered against shields, blades rang out as they met steel, and men fought hand to hand in water that ran red with blood. The screams of the wounded mingled with the roar of drums and the hiss of fire. Mongol officers shouted frantic orders, but their voices were lost in the chaos. The discipline that had carried them across continents began to unravel beneath the crushing rhythm of ambush and confusion. The warriors of the steppe fought with ferocity born of pride, but for the first time, their enemy was invisible, a phantom force that moved with the land itself. Every path they took turned into a trap, every movement met by arrows from unseen archers. From his flagship, Emperor Trần Thái Tông watched the tide of battle turn. His commanders moved with flawless coordination, executing the plan that had been forged in secret weeks before. General Trần Thái Tông led the vanguard, striking from the front to cut off any escape toward the northern bank. On the flank, Trần Thái Tông drove the invaders deeper into the killing zone, his soldiers striking from cover like spirits of the river. It was not a battle, it was a storm in motion, every strike perfectly timed, every retreat an illusion that drew the enemy closer to ruin. Uriang Hudai's banners wavered amid the chaos. His officers fell around him, their bodies trampled into the mud. The once proud Mongol formation splintered as their cavalry faltered, and their infantry drowned beneath the weight of the assault. Desperate men tried to mount their horses, but nets and ropes dragged them back down. The steppe's greatest weapon, mobility, had been stripped from them by a land that refused to yield. By midday, the Red River flowed red with blood. Burning boats drifted downstream, their flames reflected in the churning water. The few Mongols who managed to flee did so in terror, abandoning their weapons, armor, and wounded comrades behind them. From the deck of his ship, the emperor slowly lowered his sword. Around him, the thunder of drums began to fade into silence. The mist lifted, unveiling a battlefield strewn with wreckage, fire, and the fallen. The invaders were gone, and in that stillness that followed, the warriors of Visht raised their voices in one thunderous cry, not for conquest, but for their king, their land, and the freedom they had defended with their lives. The Mongol army was broken. What had once been an unstoppable iron formation of 30,000 men had dissolved into chaos, horses plunging through the mire, soldiers screaming, commanders cut down where they stood. The Red River, thick with ash and wreckage, glimmered beneath the smoke like a vein of molten metal. For the first time in their history, the warriors of the steppe were not the hunters, they were the hunted. From the banks, the drums of Unsi Visht pounded once more, echoing like the very pulse of the earth. Warboats surged through the current, chasing the fleeing enemy. Archers fired in great sweeping arcs, their arrows catching the first light of the rising sun before finding their marks among the retreating soldiers. The air itself seemed alive, the slap of paddles on water, the pounding of hooves along the flooded roads, the triumphant cries of warriors calling victory to the heavens. Uriankadai rode among the survivors, his once polished armor scorched and splattered with mud, his horse bleeding from the flank. He shouted orders, but no one could hear him over the chaos. The general who had crossed mountains and continents now found himself trapped in a land that had turned every path against him. The rivers he had thought to ford had become walls. The forests he had tried to burn now hid an army at every turn. Each path north led only to more ambushes, more death, and more despair for the once mighty invaders. The land itself seemed to rise against them. Every turn of the river, every bend of the road concealed waiting eyes, drawn bows, and sharpened blades. What had begun as an organized retreat quickly descended into chaos. The once proud formations of the Mongol army reduced to scattered bands of fugitives. At Shuangbo-Gyao, the Mongol rear guard made a desperate attempt to form a defensive line, hoping to buy time for their retreating comrades. They barely had a moment to prepare before the sound of horns and drums broke through the morning mist. From the south came the thunder of feet and the cry of vengeance as Tran So's infantry charged forward, their voices cutting through the air like blades. At the same time, from the river's shimmering surface, the Emperor's fleet emerged once more, the prows of the warboats slicing through the current as fire arrows arched overhead. The sky blazed with streaks of flame, their reflections dancing on the water like burning spirits. The two forces met in a collision of fury, the air filled with the roar of battle, the clash of metal on metal, the shattering of shields, the screams of men and horses alike. Spears splintered, arrows flew in blinding volleys, and the river boiled with the struggle as soldiers fell into the churning water, locked in combat even as they drowned. The Mongols tried to regroup, but the ground beneath them turned treacherous, the mud sucking at their boots and dragging down the wounded. Those who sought escape by land found their path cut off. The bridges that once spanned the river had been destroyed days earlier by retreating Vietnamese forces. Every road north had become a maze of traps and dead ends. Those who tried to swim across were ensnared by hidden nets or struck down by hooks thrown from the banks. The very earth seemed to conspire against them, every step forward pulling them deeper into despair. By midday, the Red River had become a graveyard. The water was choked with broken banners, shattered armor, and lifeless bodies drifting with the current. Horses lay tangled in reeds, their riders gone. Smoke from burning boats and villages curled upward into the gray sky, casting a haunting veil over the battlefield. Still, the pursuit did not stop. Through the wetlands and rice fields, the Vietnamese pressed their advantage, their pursuit relentless and unyielding. The sound of gongs and drums echoed from village to village, signaling the next ambush. Farmers, fishermen, and peasants joined the fight, striking from behind trees and dikes, hurling stones, spears, and javelins at the fleeing enemy. Women and children carried supplies to the warriors, shouting cries of defiance that rolled through the flooded fields like thunder. The Mongols were no longer an army, they were prey, hunted, harried, and broken by a people who refused to bow. Uriankadai's once proud horse stumbled in the mire, splattering mud across his battered armor. The general spurred it forward, his breath ragged beneath the weight of exhaustion and disbelief. Around him rode the remnants of his officers, faces pale, eyes hollow, men who had once commanded legions now reduced to fugitives fleeing for their lives. Their formations had dissolved, their discipline shattered. They rode not with purpose, but with desperation, their only goal to survive the land that had become their enemy. Behind them, The sound of drums grew louder, a relentless rhythm that seemed to chase them through the marshes. The calls of the Vietnamese war horns rose and fell like waves, echoing through the fog, closer and closer with every moment. By the time the sun began to sink, the Mongols were little more than shadows retreating toward the misty mountains of Yunnan. They abandoned their weapons, their dead, and the remnants of their once great banners. What had begun as a campaign of conquest ended in ruin. The empire that had believed itself invincible now fled in silence, its legend broken on the shores of the Red River. On the river banks, Emperor Trần Thái Tông stood watching as the day faded into dusk. The smoke from the battlefield hung heavy in the air, turning the horizon into a deep crimson haze. The cries of victory still echoed faintly through the delta, carried by the wind. He gazed across the waters that glimmered faintly in the dying light, the reflection of fire and blood mingling into one. The impossible had happened. The greatest army in the world had been defeated. The emperor bowed his head, not in triumph, but in reverence, to the countless souls who had fought and fallen, to the land that had guarded them, and to the indomitable spirit of his people. Around him, his generals stood in silent respect. They knew that this victory was not merely a triumph of arms, but of will, of endurance, of unity forged through suffering. For the Mongols, it was the first true defeat of their empire in the Far East. For Wolsey Visht, it was the birth of legend. As evening settled over the Red River Delta, the battlefield still smoldered. The fires that had raged through the day now burned low, their smoke coiling upward into the darkening sky, glowing faintly against the crimson of the setting sun. The air was thick with the mingled scents of iron, sweat, and ash, the bitter perfume of victory paid for in blood. Along the river banks, the warriors of Wolsey Visht stood among the wreckage in solemn silence. Some knelt to pray for the fallen, others simply stared out across the river where bodies floated in the fading light. Their faces were streaked with soot and tears, their armor dented and stained, yet in their eyes burned something greater than exhaustion, a quiet, unyielding pride. The drums that had once thundered with fury now lay silent. Only the gentle murmur of the tide remained, washing over broken shields and shattered spears, carrying away the echoes of battle. Emperor Trần Thái Tông walked among his soldiers, his steps slow and heavy. His armor was scarred, his robe torn and singed, the weight of command etched deeply into his expression, but his presence brought stillness wherever he passed. Men bowed their heads as he approached, not in formal salute, but in reverence, for they had seen their ruler fight as one of them, enduring the same hardship, breathing the same smoke, bleeding for the same cause. When he reached the edge of the river, the emperor looked north. Beyond the dark line of hills lay Yunnan, and the long broken trail of the Mongol retreat. They had come as a storm, unstoppable and fierce, but they had left as shadows, scattered and spent. No army that entered Wolsey Visht had ever returned unscarred. Now the Mongols had learned that truth in fire and blood. The message carved into the heart of empire was clear. This land could be entered, but never conquered. The victory had come at a terrible price. Villages lay in ashes, fields were flooded, and countless families had been torn apart by war. Yet amid the devastation, something unbreakable had been forged, a unity stronger than steel, born not from conquest, but from the shared resolve to survive. The emperor's strategy had proven that wisdom and patience could overcome brute strength, that the courage of ordinary men could stand against the might of empires. It was not merely a military triumph, but a testament to the spirit of a people who refused to yield. As the first stars appeared over the quiet river, the soldiers began to sing. Their voices were low and weary, yet carried the weight of generations. The song spoke of fathers and sons, of rivers and freedom, of home and sacrifice. The melody drifted across the delta, mingling with the night breeze and the faint crackle of dying fires. High above the smoke and ruin, the imperial banner of the Trent dynasty fluttered against the twilight. torn, blackened, but still standing. The Mongols had come to test the heart of a nation, and in the heart of Wolsey Visht, they found something they could never defeat. Weeks passed before the smoke over the Red River finally began to fade, its dark plumes dissolving into the clear skies of a land slowly beginning to heal. The fires of war had burned themselves out, leaving behind fields scarred by battle and villages reduced to ashes, yet life, stubborn and enduring, began to return. When the emperor's fleet sailed back toward Thing Long, the waters shimmered under the morning sun, reflecting a sky washed clean by rain and time, a sky that seemed reborn. The capital, once a ghost city of empty streets and silent halls, stirred with life again. From the forests and marshlands came streams of people, farmers, craftsmen and families who had fled when the Mongols advanced. They carried what little they had salvaged, bundles of grain, tools, tattered banners, and the hope that home still waited for them. Smoke from hearth fires once more rose from the rooftops. The clang of hammers and the creak of rebuilding scaffolds echoed through the narrow streets where only wind had walked weeks before. Broken walls were mended stone by stone. Temples that had stood dark through the war relit their lanterns, their flickering flames glowing softly in the dusk, as if guiding the souls of the fallen home. The sound of chanting and the scent of burning incense drifted through the air, mingling with the rhythmic pounding of carpenters' mallets and the laughter of children who had not forgotten how to smile. At the heart of the city, in the great square of Thing Long, Emperor Trần Thái Tông stood before his people. There was no crown upon his head, no gleam of jewels or gold. His armor still bore the dents of battle. His robe was frayed at the edges, and his face carried the weight of exhaustion. Yet in his eyes shone a quiet strength, the calm of a man who had faced the jaws of death and emerged not untouched, but unbroken. Before him, soldiers knelt side by side with peasants, fishermen and monks. The distinctions that had once divided rank and class had vanished in the fires of war. They had all bled for the same land, and in that moment, they were one people, united not by command, but by sacrifice. The emperor looked upon them, the tired faces, the soot-streaked hands, the eyes that had seen horror but still held light, and spoke. His voice carried, not the tone of a ruler, but of a father addressing his children. They came with fire and steel, he said, his voice steady echoing across the square, and found a land that would not burn. Let this victory remind our children that freedom is not given by kings, but earned by those who stand together. His words resonated like a prayer, traveling beyond the palace walls, carried by the wind through the streets, along the rivers, and into the distant mountains. Those who heard them felt their hearts stir, for they knew they had not merely survived a war, they had preserved a soul. In the months that followed, the story of Chon Bu Shao spread across Idsi Visht. From the bustling marketplaces of the cities to the quiet courtyards of mountain temples, people told the tale of how their ancestors had defied the world's most powerful empire. Farmers sang of the victory as they tilled their fields, monks whispered it in meditations, and mothers told it to their children by the light of oil lamps. It was no longer a story of battle, it had become a living promise that even the smallest nation, if bound by unity and love for its land, could stand against the might of conquerors. Years later, when the Mongols returned in even greater numbers, they would no longer find the hesitant nation they had once sought to crush. They would find a people ready, not only with sharpened blades and fortified walls, but with memory, courage, and the belief that their forebears had faced the storm and survived. The fire of that victory still burned in their hearts, a beacon that neither time nor terror could extinguish. For generations, the triumph at Chon Bu Shao lived on as more than history. It became legend, carried in songs and engraved in the hearts of the people. It was proof that courage and wisdom, when joined as one, could bend even the course of destiny. Children grew up hearing the names of their heroes, the emperor who would not yield, the generals who fought like thunder, the villagers who turned their land into a weapon, and they dreamed of living with the same strength. As twilight fell over Long, the city glowed with the light of countless lanterns. The scent of the river breeze mingled with that of fresh earth and incense, the mingled fragrance of renewal. The war was over, but its echoes still lingered in the beating of drums carried faintly on the wind. Emperor Trần Thái Tông walked alone along the river bank, his reflection wavering in the golden-red glow of the sunset. The water rippled with color, crimson like the blood that had been shed, gold like the hope that now bloomed once more. The emperor gazed across the river, where the first stars had begun to appear, and whispered softly, almost to himself, "The land endures because its people endure." The words hung in the air like a vow, and with that, the story of a small kingdom that had stood defiant before the greatest empire on earth passed into legend, carried by wind and song, etched forever into the soul of a nation.